Hi everyone. So today we're going to go over how to paint a skull. So we're going to do the wet on wet technique for this so it all blends together, and I'm going to show you how to produce some depth. So we'll get dark in places like the eyeballs and the nose cavity, and other places where that the light hit, sort of like on the top of the skull and the cheekbone here, will stay pretty light. Okay, so I'm gonna start painting in this eye socket here. And you'll see throughout this video how many layers it takes to get really dark. It's a process, but we'll get through it. So I'm just gonna use this brown, sort of dilute it a little bit. In previous videos, we've talked about how transparency is sort of the bedrock, the cornerstone of watercolor. So that means layers to get really dark shadows take a long time. We have to work with a lot of layers. So here, I already put water down so this will blend. We'll sort of have an overall, this will sort of all even out eventually. So we'll do this to all the really dark spots of the skull, the eye sockets, and the nose. Other places that are going to get pretty dark is this, in the back of the teeth, sort of the jawline area. And this cheekbone here will produce a shadow. If your light source is coming from the top, then the cheekbone shadow will happen underneath it. And then this area gets a little shadow as well, since this is sort of the underside of the skull. So we'll sort of put this all in shadow. Another area as well is the bottom row of teeth. Those will be in shadow as well, sort of under this chin area, and the chin area itself. So that's pretty much where all the shadows on the skull will go. All right, so we're putting more shadow inside these eye sockets and different cavities of the skull. You can see I'm using sort of the dark umber, burnt umber color, and I'm getting it pretty thin. You've learned already in this class about glazing and layering, so we're gonna be doing a lot of that in the skull, with a lot of different colors, but we're gonna start with browns, and then we'll get in there with some reds and blues to get some really darks. So I didn't do this before, but we all know that human bone isn't pure white. So I'm gonna come into the skull and just put a base of like a very, very, very thin brown, and hopefully that will sort of blend in the borders of these shadows here, making the bone not bright white. Okay, so that gives you a better sense of where the skull is now that everything's sort of toned down a little bit with browns. So I have here about a grayish purple, which is a combination of basically these four colors, the orange, magenta, and two different blues to reach this purple color. So that purple is going to show, or start to show, a really deep shadow for these areas that no light can get to at all. So here you can see that I've put that purplish color in all the places where shadows will go. I'm going to use this same purple that we used that first layer. I'm going to use that a couple more times, and then I'm going to add to that purple some of these browns to make it a different shade. So I'm just going to keep painting and recording so you can see what those layers look like. I'm also using a smaller brush. This is the brush I was using before, this one. I'm going to a smaller one so I can try to get a little bit more brush strokes and more detail with a smaller brush. Okay, I added more in there. So now I'm going to take that purple we were using and put some browns in there to get sort of a different value to add to those shadows. Okay, so now with that purpley brown now, those really deep pockets of shadow. So this really indicates the inside of the skull, this space here. So it should be really pretty dark. And again, these eye sockets are the eye sockets and the nose socket here are basically going to be the darkest things on the skull. So that's nearly, I think, the amount of detail that I'm going to show, at least in this video. Feel free to use a lot more layers, put a lot more detail in there if you want. Last thing I'm going to show you is putting a little shadow down here. So I'm just using the water that I have. I guess it's a little green with all the colors that I've used. So I'm just gonna, with water, sort of indicate where I want that shadow to go. And then I'll use that same sort of brown purple color to plug that shadow in. Making sure that the shadow stays a little bit more dense and darker right under the skull, and then it'll get lighter the further you get out. So here's the finished product, the human skull that's all dry. You'll use these same techniques for the cat skull. You can use different brushes, different kind of brush strokes. You can do one on wet paper versus one on dry paper just to see the difference again. I just want the human and the whatever animal skull you use to look fairly different in the way that you've applied the watercolor. Okay.